So now we've looked through two common responses to the problem of evil, namely the free will defense and Hick's Irenaean theodicy. And in both of those examples, we found that those responses just aren't up to the challenge of confronting the horrors and reality of slavery and racism. So that then raises the question: what should we do? Where should we go from there? Is that it? Has thinking about those particular historical and concrete examples just proven that there is no way of responding to the problem of evil? Or are there other less common responses that are worthy of our attention? Now, you'll have to decide for yourself whether or not you think some of the alternative approaches to the problem of evil provide a sufficient response to the issues raised by slavery and racism. But one of those alternative responses that I think is deserving of our attention is that offered by William Jones in his book, Is God a White Racist? I think that title is often very shocking to people. When I assign it in class or discuss it with students, people find the question itself almost unimaginable. I mean, how can you ask if God is racist? After all, whether you believe in God or not, most people's conception of God doesn't allow for God to be racist. And I think that's the first starting point for thinking about these issues and the real provocation of William Jones's book. Why isn't that a question that we ask? If we look at history, if we look around the world today and look at the uneven distribution of suffering, one of the questions that Jones thinks we should ask is, why does it seem like God doesn't like some groups of people? And again, a very difficult, challenging, and probably uncomfortable question for lots of people, but one that I think is deserving of some attention. So let's look at Jones's argument in a bit more detail. Now, we're already familiar with the division between natural evil and moral evil as a way of differentiating different kinds of evil that we might focus on. Jones introduces a new distinction within the category of moral evil, namely that of between sort of suffering in general and ethnic suffering. And he thinks there are four attributes that distinguish ethnic suffering from other forms of suffering. So for Jones, ethnic suffering is defined by maldistribution, negative quality, enormity, and its non-catastrophic character. So maldistribution means that this form of suffering is not distributed evenly across the human population. Though we can talk about forms of slavery that aren't chattel slavery, or the kind of slavery that was practiced in the transatlantic slave trade, that form of suffering impacted one group of people more than other groups of people. And that is what distinguishes ethnic suffering from suffering in general. You could make the same argument about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. So that's the first defining feature of ethnic suffering. Its uneven distribution. The fact that it seems like some populations are targeted for more suffering than other populations. The second defining characteristic is its negative quality. Now, we normally think of suffering and evil as negative things, but what Jones means here is that there isn't a redemptive feature to this suffering. There's no way of easily situating it within a narrative in which people undergo suffering and then come out on the other side having learned a valuable lesson or benefited from that suffering in some way. It seems fairly obvious to me that to talk about slavery as something good happening to a group of people is deeply offensive and misguided. Not that some people don't try to make those kinds of arguments, but I think the kinds of suffering, the crimes that were committed in the practice of slavery mean that the forms of suffering and pain experienced in those in that historical period is beyond redemption. The third characteristic of ethnic suffering is its enormity. And by that, Jones is identifying the way that that this form of suffering impacts a significant percentage of the members of a particular social group. So when we talk about racism in America or in the UK, that racism impacts a significant number of people who are identified as Black or Asian or by some other racial category. So it's not an isolated few examples, but something which impacts a large percentage of a group of people. And it also extends over a large swath of history. We're not talking about something which is an occasional event, but something which marks our society in a significant way. And that brings us to our final characteristic, which is the non-catastrophic nature of ethnic suffering. Now, by non-catastrophic, Jones is not in any way implying that brutal and acute forms of violence aren't experienced by people both under slavery and more contemporarily under racism or as a consequence of racism. Rather, he's saying that it's relentless. It's sort of always there. It never goes away. As I mentioned before, slavery lasted a very long time, 300 years. Think about how many people live and die. That's generations of people living under slavery, in which there seems no plausible ends in sight to this horrific practice. And so the fact that there is no visible or imaginable end to this particular kind of suffering is part of what makes it distinct from other forms of suffering or evil. So this is the first way that I think Jones can help us think about the problem of evil and the reality of suffering in new ways by helping us identify forms of suffering which are distinct from a more kind of general category of suffering, which is something that we might all experience. We're all subject to violence. We're all subject to illness, to pain, to loss, but we're not all subject to those things in the same way. And ethnic suffering is a useful tool in identifying a particular kind of suffering which is distinct from other forms of suffering. The second idea that we can take from Jones's work is the multievidentiality of suffering. Now, multievidentiality is quite the mouthful, but it's a term that Jones uses to discuss the way that suffering, any particular instance of suffering, whether that is suffering in general or more specifically ethnic suffering, is open to multiple interpretations. It can be seen as a sign of God's election. We could talk about evil and suffering as in terms of the suffering servant, the figure from Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible, so that God has chosen some people to undergo difficulties and struggles as part of his redemptive plan for the world. Or we could talk about suffering and evil in terms of God's judgment. Maybe God is punishing a person or people for their sins, for not being sufficiently devoted to God, to worshiping idols. The Bible is replete with stories that can be used to discuss the idea of God's judgment. And so Jones's point isn't that we should endorse one of these interpretations, but that it's not clear how we should interpret a particular incident of suffering. For Jones, what usually happens is that people start with the assumption that God is good and then go from there. The reason that we never ask, is God a white racist, is because we are taught to think of God as good. And so starting with that assumption, we have to work out a solution to our inconsistent triad. But if we don't start with that assumption, if we just look around the world, if we look at all the historical evidence that we have, if we look at the experiences of people living and their experiences of racism today, what we get is a much more ambiguous picture, and that's the best case scenario. Really what we see as a world filled with suffering, not just in general, but instances of ethnic suffering. And the challenge is what we should do about that.